Well, welcome to today's event. I'm Jacques Delisle. I'm the director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're delighted to be back here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This has become something of an annual tradition, a joint conference by FPRI's Asia program and the Wilson Center's Asia program as well. So we're delighted to be back here. It's, as always, a pleasure to work with my co-organizer on these things, Shihoko Goto, of the Asia program here, and we look forward to continuing our cooperation with the Asia program is led by the new director, Abe Denmark, who'll be up here in a moment. This conference, of course, is on non-traditional security in Asia, disaster response and cybersecurity in a time of rising challenges and constrained resources. Lest we need any reminders, it's hit very close to home recently. We've had, of course, 2 hurricanes in the American South, and we've had the Equifax hack. The America-centric view of Americans will not preclude thinking about this, but these issues have been especially large in Asia, very large-scale challenges of cybersecurity and of natural disasters. They're the chronic smallish ones, and then they're the ones we all remember still years later. On the disaster side, things like, of course, the tsunami in Southeast Asia and the later one that hit Fukushima, the earthquake in Sichuan, and the problems that have occurred with earthquakes and such in the Himalayas. On the cyber side, of course, the North Korean attack on various targets in the U.S., several of them, and being an issue in bilateral relations even before the recent spike in tensions between the 2 countries. And, of course, chronic worries about Chinese cyber theft and information warfare, commercial espionage, and many other issues. It's telling that in the last U.S. administration, the Obama administration, these issues were front and center in what many would call the world's most important bilateral relationship. The breakthrough on climate change, of course, just before the Paris Accords, put one of the major sources of natural disasters front and center in U.S.-China relations, and, of course, the agreement on how to address cyber theft, cyber espionage, and so on. Those came against the background of an ongoing tension between the United States and China over regulation of the internet sovereignty, as well as rising roles of the People's Liberation Army Navy and the U.S. Navy in the South China Sea and other areas where much of it is, of course, about traditional security, but disaster relief and humanitarian assistance have been part of the mix as well. As we enter this new period under the current administration, the Trump administration, of course, we've seen withdrawal from the Paris Accords, and we've seen a fairly tough line, at least sometimes, on economic relations with China, where unfair Chinese practices in the mind of the administration in the economy are a major source of friction, including, of course, things having to do with the loss of intellectual property, which has been partly a target of cyber espionage, cyber spying. So as these snippets reflect, and again, everybody in this room knows these things, these are big, complex, and vital issues, and they're only going to get bigger in the world, and specifically in Asia and in U.S. relations with the region. Risks from disaster, of course, grow as population density and economic growth continues in vulnerable areas and exacerbated by climate change. On the cyber side, of course, we see the relentless rise and dependence on digital technology in everything we do, from national defense to high-tech businesses, from critical infrastructure to daily life, including soon-to-be self-driving cars, surely. And with that, the vulnerabilities to cybersecurity issues, cyber threats, and hacking grow ever greater. The responses have been, as always, to a significant degree governmental, perhaps most notably the way militaries have taken on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief roles and have developed cyber warfare units and focused on cyber attack prevention and defense. Diplomats, of course, too, are increasingly engaged with these kinds of issues as a big part of their work. But one of the things that makes non-traditional security, or at least these slices of non-traditional security, non-traditional, is in part that the nature of the challenges and the scope of the challenges are such that entities outside national governments are a big part of the response as well. Cybersecurity threats target, of course, the economy and infrastructure and private firms, and those entities are at the front lines in many cases of dealing with the threat. And in terms of natural disasters, or not so natural disasters, there's always been a large role for non-governmental organizations and local governments as first responders, and now increasingly as the entities that help build resistance for when the disasters do strike. So that's not a terribly cheery set of topics to be dealing with, but we have a terrific group of people to deal with them with 2 keynote addresses and 2 panels. So before we turn to that substantive part of our program, I'd like to turn it over to our host, Abe Denmark, to make some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Jacques. and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Abe Denmark. I am the new director of the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. We have a very broad mandate here at the Asia Center. We basically cover everything from Afghanistan and Pakistan all the way through basically to Hawaii, which covers a lot of different kinds of challenges. And we were excited about putting this initiative together and this meeting together, in part because it deals with some of the more complicated challenges facing the Asia Pacific, both cybersecurity and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And one of the points that I think is going to become increasingly clear throughout today, and then going on into the future, is that these issues that we're dealing with will soon become traditional security issues in the Asia Pacific. Cybersecurity issues is already fundamental to the dynamics of the region and will become even more so as the region becomes increasingly interconnected and as our economies become increasingly dependent on cyber, as do our militaries. Additionally, as climate change continues to adjust the physical landscape of the Asia Pacific and put increasing thousands and millions of people at risk to rising sea levels and increasingly intense weather events, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is only going to increase in terms of demand and need from both the American military and American relief organizations, as well as those from major powers across the Asia Pacific. So we were very happy to be able to partner with FPRI for putting this event together, and we're very thankful to be able to have this relationship, that we can work on these issues together. And I'm very personally very thankful to all the people who've agreed to participate. If you look at the people speaking, both giving keynote addresses and participating in the panels that we have, it's an incredible accumulation of expertise and knowledge that I think rivals any conference on these subjects that have been put together in Washington in recent memory. So we're very thankful to all the participants and to all of you for coming this morning. So it is my pleasure to kick things off by introducing Eric Rosenbach. Eric served in several senior positions in the Department of Defense, the most recent being Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. He and I were somewhat partners in crime, flying around the Asia Pacific and working in the Pentagon to put out whatever fires rise up in the day. So I was, when we started talking about cybersecurity, this is an area of his special expertise, and I wanted to invite him to see if he could come. He's currently co-director of the Belfer Center at Harvard, and we're very happy that he could come here. So I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
All right, thanks a lot, Dave. Oh, my mic's going. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and very appreciative that FPRI and the Wilson Center invited me to speak. So I'd first like to thank Jacques and FPRI. Thanks very much for doing that. And you know, the Wilson Center is very lucky to have Abe Denmark, because this is a really high quality person and human, but also someone who has very deep expertise in Asia and has served in a senior role where he's really seen how policy is made and how difficult it can be sometimes to advance the national interest and get things done. So y'all are lucky to have him. I'm also a big fan of Abe, not only because he's a good guy, really smart, and even in the toughest situations we had with Secretary Carter, he's from Colorado like I am. We're both Denver Broncos fans, so that's also something important. I also wanted to say a special word of thanks to Rachel from FPRI, because she's done a lot of the logistics associated with this, and you know, putting together conferences is not easy, I know, from everything we do up at Harvard. So I wanted to point out. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the way that I'm going to do this. You know, normally you would expect a set piece speech and that I would go up here and I would just tell you what I thought was most important. That's not the way I operate. So what I would like to do, and this will be maybe unusual and a little uncomfortable for y'all, but I'm going to run this as if it's one of my classes, which is via the Socratic method. That means that I have a couple points that I'm going to make, but then I am literally going to call on people in the audience and ask for their perspective on a question that I pose, because I know when it comes down to it that the collective brain power in this room far exceeds anything that would come close to mine. And so this is the way we're going to work through it. First, I would like to talk a little bit about China, then talk a little bit about North Korea. You see the title of my talk, which is Firewalls and Fireballs, Firewalls in China and Fireballs from DPRK. So we'll work through those. And then we're going to talk about some of the other cyber powers in the region, Japan, Australia, Singapore in particular. You know, giving you a little bit of a heads up, I'll be walking around. The way I usually do this, y'all should be thinking right now, is I almost always start in the back corners of the room, because I find the people in the back corners either didn't do their homework, want to fall asleep, or think they would never get called on. Also, the next people most likely to get called on are those who are on their iPhone pretending they can't possibly get called on. So just be prepared. And please excuse me if I say you and point. I'm not meaning to be rude, just since I don't have name tags and know very many of you all personally if I point. You can help this move along by raising your hand and volunteering. Otherwise, you know, I'll have to do the hard cold call. Okay, so here's where I'd like to start. I usually start in thinking about anything as it relates to cyber much more broadly, which is talking about the national interest. The national interest itself is something that is kind of an American-centric idea, that a nation only pursues its interests, but not really. I think it's fair to say the Chinese, for example, have their national interest. They just articulate it with different language. So what I'd first like to do is, in terms of cyberspace, and I'm going to call on the person in the back left corner here, ma'am, you should be ready. Yep, that's you. Right. So talk to me a little bit about China's national interests as they relate to cyberspace. What do you think are the core national interests, the most important things for China? And another caveat I'll say, if I say the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, I'm talking about their government, not the people. So, you know, we're just trying to keep things straight here. National interests of China as it relates to cyberspace. What would you think?
So my name is Wu. I'm a scholar here in the Asia program.
Oh, perfect. See, she actually knows what she's talking about. Okay.
And I actually, a few years ago, wrote a book on telecom policy reform in China.
Okay. This is my go-to person right here.
I'm glad I got this question and
Great.
the next one.
No, I'll give you the hard ones too. This was not even staged.
Yeah. Okay, so I think generally, in my view, and I should also say that I'm on leave from the Federal Communications Commission, so I have a kind of civilian
this is your
regulatory
personal view, not that of the FCC.
Right.
I'll help you out.
But just to say I have a more civilian, a kind of a commercial regulatory view of this. I think in my personal view, looking back at the history of communications policy in China, there are sort of two goals, and they come into conflict. The first goal of developing the communication system, which is relatively newly built. I mean, phones were not that common until the 1990s. And then, you know, with the huge growth of mobile phones, then you have this very contemporary, very up-to-date system. I think the first goal was to develop the economy, to support the economy. And the second goal, as it has always been in China with communication systems, going way back to the development of the cable TV system and the development of CCTV, is to have a channel for the government to reach the people and make sure that the people were informed about the government's views. And with the internet, you have this opportunity not only to for the state to broadcast its views, but also to keep an eye on what people are saying to each other. So there's this aspect of ideological surveillance and ideological control, and from the state's perspective, I think preservation of their own political status.
Great.
But I would say that that's in tension with the economic development.
That's perfect. So it's as if I planted her in the audience and knew that she was going to say exactly what I have on my outline here. There are two core vital national interests when it comes to China and thinking about cyber and technology issues more broadly. So the first is definitely focused on an economic angle of economic development and advancing the growth of the country in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about some of those. The second, when it comes down to it, is controlling the flow of information and the type of information. So we're actually going to start on that second part. So I'm going to go now to the other corner, and here's a little prompt. The way this works best is if we try to move fast. So you give pretty quick answer and then we go to someone else and we keep it moving. So it's no criticism of you. That was a great starting point. But yes, sir, that's you in the light blue shirt back there. Talk to me a little bit about that second part in controlling information. What does, from literally an operational perspective, what are some of the best indicators of China doing that and how it operationalizes that national interest?
Well, I have to say this is very sneaky technique on your part. I'm Bob Hathaway. I'm a public policy scholar here, and I commend my colleagues in the Asia program as well as FPRI for organizing this. What was missing from the first answer that I might have added is and this gets to your question, the party's determination to retain a monopoly on political power.
Okay.
To get to your question, I think the extent to which the authorities are able to stifle dissent, stifle anything that might remotely challenge their monopoly on political power is clearly an indication of how successful they are in maintaining their objectives with respect to cybersecurity. They obviously also want to prevent outside powers, and they would say specifically the United States, from disrupting the workings of the government and the party, much like we've seen efforts by some Chinese to disrupt our apparatus.
Good. Okay. So good. We're getting on the right track now. I've been called things far worse than sneaky, so that doesn't even faze me. And the idea here is we're trying to get everyone to learn together. Now, what we're talking about is definitely the control of information. And there's something that is the most symbolic of that that's in the title of the speech. Who can tell me here about the Great Firewall, how that actually works, and why that really is one of the best ways to think about cyber policy when it comes to China and their strategy moving forward? Who has an idea and wants to explain? It's also important, really, how to work in the basics and then what the intent is. All right, I'm going to Abe Denmark because I know he's not a cyber guy, but he'll be able to talk enough about it. Abe, talk to us about the Great Firewall, a little bit about how it works, and then what's the big idea here with the Great Firewall? Yeah, you're going to get a lot of hard policy questions too.
That's why I should have left when you started. As I understand it, the firewall, one of the main advantages of the Chinese firewall is that China has a very limited number of access points in which it connects with the outside world.
Yes, right.
And so therefore, the government is able to put controls into place about what goes in and out of the firewall.
Yes.
So it's sort of a nationalist sovereignty approach to information security.
Great.
And what I'd say is that it feeds into what I think is, and Bob just mentioned this, the primary objective for the Chinese Communist Party being control.
Exactly. So there are a couple of things when we pull this apart, a couple of really important things that Abe said here. First of all, is that from a technology perspective, it's increasingly evident that the Great Firewall is effective and that it's something that actually changes the way that Chinese citizens interact with the world in a way that I think has been surprising to a lot of people who, even from a technical perspective, were very skeptical about whether or not you could do such a thing. Here's in very base form how it works. Just like Abe said, there are a certain number of controlled access points. That matters a lot because that means when you can funnel all traffic in and out of a country through specific gateways, it means that you can monitor it, that you can censor it, and that you can block it. So they will use deep packet inspection, which is what you do when you're looking for security threats, or also monitoring content in order to give at least some preliminary protection in terms of bad information. Or I think it's really important to remember that other nations are trying to conduct espionage against the Chinese and may be thinking about how to operationalize certain cyber things. That Great Firewall also changes the strategic way in which you would think about cyber operations, right? So here's an analogy. The Department of Defense runs the biggest enterprise network in the world. That means, we're our own organization. We also have a limited number of access points, 10 internet access points. Essentially what we're doing is running something like the Great Firewall of China. There's no, should not be, any information that gets into the Department of Defense network that doesn't go through one of those gateways, isn't screened by special security things we do and high-end technology. Pretty similar. We do that at the Department of Defense to protect ourselves because it's one of the most targeted networks in the world. The Chinese do that for many of the reasons that the gentleman mentioned in the back corner. So that is really important. On the other hand, I think it's really important to note that while there's an obvious reason that the Chinese government wants to try to control information, in particular after the Arab Spring and some of the color revolutions and with the advent of social media, and I would dare say that the Chinese very closely watched what happened in the United States over the past year, it makes it even more important to them that the Great Firewall is intact, and then they're more easily able to control flows of information domestically in social media. That's why you see Facebook and other American social media firms having a lot of trouble operating there, period. There's another thing, though, that the Great Firewall does that I want to make sure people understand, and it's more aggressive. So is there anyone here who knows about the GitHub attack? I know I'm starting to sound a little techie wonky on you. Anyone who remembers GitHub and what that was and what that was about? This is a specific thing, so if there's not someone who knows, then I'll relieve you the stress of being cold-hauled. Okay. GitHub was a small tech firm in California that was, among other things, hosting content of several organizations that were contrary to all the things that the party in China believes in, right? So it's like a little bit about Tibet, about the Dalai Lama, other things that politically were very sensitive to the Chinese government. And the Chinese government had tried other ways to get them off the internet and had seen, this was about 4 years ago, that many people in China were trying to find ways to circumvent the Great Firewall to go and look at the content that was here. Essentially, they were setting up a Chinese version also of the New York Times, trying to give some objective media reporting on news on things that are going on in China. So what the Chinese did at the time, and this was a very big deal to us in the Department of Defense, is they used a special technical mechanism in which they harnessed the technical power of the Great Firewall of China to fire on the GitHub server and knock it offline, and continue to do that to the point that GitHub was never ever actually able to recover until there were more protective measures put in place. So in cyber terms, this is called a distributed denial of service attack. The thing that was different is we'd never seen the Great Firewall used for offensive purposes, but it comes again to one of those core national interests of the Chinese, which is protecting information and trying to control the information available to Chinese when they read. Things have gotten a little bit even, I think, stricter in China now. Previously, you could download VPN software. This is a virtual private network. Again, I don't expect you all to be techies, but the idea is that you could download software on your laptop and that would connect in a way that would drill a little tunnel through the Great Firewall and allow people in China access to the outside. So even Western journalists were using VPN so that their traffic would be protected, couldn't be read. There's been a very strong effort in China recently to block even VPN traffic. So the Great Firewall is something that is really important to understand. Okay, I want to move on to the next thing that was mentioned when we talked about two core interests when it comes to China. Who can tell me a little bit about some of the things that have been going on with commercial espionage and theft of IP by the Chinese government, and why that matters, first of all, to the Chinese, second of all, to other people around the world? I know a lot of people have worked on that. Who can give me the base argument for that? Okay, sir, how about you? Light blue shirt, yes.
They hacked OPM.
The hacked OPM. Okay, we'll set that aside for a second. OPM, from my perspective, not a good example of commercial espionage.
Commercial espionage, then.
Yes.
Then we're getting beyond my field. Maybe Equifax, I don't know who did it, but.
Could be. So we don't want to dwell in conspiracy theory. That could be them. But just think, even if you're not an expert, think through this. Why is it in the strategic interests of the Chinese to use cyber power, to use the 3 PLA? That's like the 3rd Division of the People's Liberation Army, an intelligence organization, or the 2 PLA, to steal industrial secrets from the Germans, from the Americans, from the UK? How does that fit into what we heard earlier as part of their overall national strategy?
Well, one would say that once they've stolen industrial secrets, they can replicate the products that are in those blueprints more easily within China itself.
Yeah, that's part of the idea. It looks like this gentleman in front of you, he may have some ideas about that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
You know what Boeing or Lockheed Martin has built into aircraft that's being purchased by the American military and by America's allies because you've stolen the plan. So it's not just you build your own 787s, you know what the B-1 bombers have in them.
Yeah, that's right. So there are two things here that intellectually you can make a distinction. The one that is actually illegal under US law is stealing intellectual property from a private sector firm, right? By law, the NSA or the CIA or any intel firm is not permitted to steal intellectual property or plans in a way that would benefit a private sector firm in the United States. Defense contracting is a little bit different. We worried a lot about that when I was in charge of cyber for almost 6 years at the Department of Defense, the Cyber Czar and Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Secretary. We worried a lot about that because we were concerned that we had spent hundreds of billions of dollars to develop the technology in the F-35, but unfortunately, some of the defense contractors weren't able to protect that, and so you would see it going out the door and worry a lot that part of the advantage of that investment is that people couldn't understand how it worked, that the Chinese in particular were able to do that. On the commercial side, you worry that there's a pharmaceutical firm that may also have invested billions of dollars in R&D, however, didn't protect their IP well enough from a cybersecurity perspective, it goes out the door, and then you'll see a special Chinese version that is nearly identical to that appear on the market and undercut that. So as you heard, we in the government saw that that was a serious problem. This was more about 5 years ago, and after several years of, I don't want to sound too harsh because I was part of that team, there's a little bit of dilly-dallying about whether or not we would even publicly acknowledge that and directly confront the Chinese about it. We were having negotiations with them the entire time. I, along with this guy, Chris Painter from the State Department, were going to China, and they were coming here fairly frequently to talk this through. But it's not always productive. So Abe, I'm sure, could do this too, but by the time we'd had the 10th meeting with the Chinese, I had their talking points like completely memorized. I knew when I sat down, I could recite them literally by the exact syllable because it did not vary. It would go something like this. Hacking is illegal in China. Because hacking is illegal in China, it's entirely impossible that there's anyone in China who is doing hacking. You'd be like, okay, that's a pretty tight logical argument, but it ignores kind of the reality. I think we did make some progress. There, I don't think, are active negotiations right now, but it is one of these things where it's important to engage with them and continue to work on that. You'll see the conventional wisdom now is that the theft of intellectual property by the Chinese has diminished. I hate to sound cynical. Personally, I believe that the Chinese now are just much more careful, much more professional, and are getting caught far less often than they were before, where it was a more kind of industrial scale hoovering up of things. There's one other point I want to make about China before we move on, is that the Chinese also use cyber power in a way that advanced their national interests in a regional sense. So I don't have to tell you all, but the Chinese have very, very strong interests in the South China Sea and a lot of their regional security. So here are some examples of how they would use cyber to advance their interests as it relates to the South China Sea in the last couple of years in particular from a cyber perspective. So here's an example. This was hours after the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling on the South China Sea was in favor of the Philippines. I think all of you all have been tracking this. Remember that it was pretty ground shaking in that it was very clearly not for the Chinese position. The Chinese launched a massive DDoS attack in which a lot of government websites in the Philippines were taken down. And then also in Vietnam, literally hacked into the airport public affairs system, an announcement, and started broadcasting pro-Chinese messages about the South China Sea and their position and why the ruling was wrong. Also dumped the passenger information of about 400,000 passengers onto the internet. So that's one of those things where that's a little aggressive, right? That's kind of in your face. Generally, the Chinese are not aggressive about doing offensive operations against the United States or our allies, which is very different than the North Koreans, who we'll talk about next. But they will use it as a way to advance their agenda, and I think that's something that is interesting to consider. Okay. The other issue you mentioned, but we're not going to spend time on here, is that the Chinese also are investing a lot in organically grown technology like Huawei, like ZTE, because they recognize the need to be able to challenge the United States, in particular in the tech sector. I think that was even more firmly underscored after the Snowden affair, because they felt in some ways accurate, most ways not, that it showed that they could never trust any type of US technology that was going to be used by the Chinese. So we'll move on. Okay, so that's framing up China. Next, briefly, we want to talk about the North Koreans. So let's see, I'm going to call on someone who's going to spin out a little bit the North Korean perspective on cyber and the national interest. Everyone's trying to look down, so I'm going to pick on, there's a young woman right here in white with a black shirt. Can you tell me a little bit, if you're comfortable, about how the North Koreans perceive cyber, and what are North Koreans' national interests when it comes to cyber issues?
Hi, I'm an intern at Kissinger Institute, and
Okay,
I believe
she's super smart too.
no, actually, I believe the priority for North Korean is to block any Western idea, as well as China's or Japan or Koreans' information to the country. And I will say they would love to be isolated by the rest of the world, instead of by intervening by other powers, I guess.
Right. Okay, so that's the most important thing is, even compared to the Chinese who want to control their information, this is a very extreme situation, right? There are more internet users in China than anywhere in the world. And what has been interesting about that is there's a very, very vibrant, only purely domestic Chinese internet that works. And the Chinese, for the most part, appear not to care that much about that and not be bothered. North Korea is something different altogether, right? There's very low internet penetration, mostly because Kim Jong-un and the regime are trying to keep most people disconnected. So that's a very important point. Thank you. And then I pre-selected someone in the back row over here. She used to work at the Pentagon, so we can have even higher expectations. But tell me a little bit about some of North Korea's other national interests when it comes to cyber power, cyber operations.
I'm sorry, other national?
Yeah, so we know they want to remain isolated and the control of information. What are some other things when you're thinking about North Korea and cyber that are important for people to understand in their interests?
I guess, well, the people can't have access to the internet, really, and
that's true. I'll give you a little hint.
Sure.
You remember this instance of Sony and the Sony cyber attack?
Oh.
Pull that out for me and kind of like what that illustrated in terms of the North Koreans and their willingness to use cyber as a tool to advance their foreign policy.
I don't think I would be the expert on this.
Okay, who knows something about the Sony hack? And yes, sir, right down here. We'll have this is Rachel's going to run the mic down. She's also getting a little exercise today.
Walk the mic.
Walk the mic, okay. All right. Yes, sir, tell us a little bit about the Sony cyber attack and what that shows about the North Koreans and their perspective on using cyber power.
Well, it was in response to a movie about Kim Jong-un and I think it was Hired Assassins.
Yeah. Does anyone remember? This was like the Seth Rogen movie, right? Seth Rogen, this was like dark humor where it was all set up that he was going to go in as a CIA operative and try to assassinate Kim Jong-un. That had these like amazing scenes where Kim Jong-un's head was going to explode and Seth Rogen was kind of the hero. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about. You remember that movie?
Yes, so in response to that, they hacked into Sony and I think they distributed that. Certainly beyond what Sony had anticipated and wanted initially. In fact, they didn't even show the film.
Yeah, that's right.
They had done a real number on Sony.
Right. So Not only did they dox, that's again the cyber wonky term for when you hack in, take information, and then publicly post it, you've been doxed. You just saw another nation state do that a lot during the most recent election cycle. That's a very potent hybrid form of cyber attacks. But in the case of the Sony attack by the North Koreans, it was the first destructive cyber attack against the United States ever, right? So they not only hacked in and stole information and released it in a way that was very sophisticated and showed pretty sophisticated understanding of the media, American politics. I remember the things that they released that were kind of eye-popping were conversations between the CEOs and other senior people that were outright racist remarks about President Obama. That didn't go over very well. There were listings of salaries that showed very clearly that most of the leading female actors for Sony Pictures Enterprises were making far less money than all the men. That was a little controversial to see the data right there. Plus, a lot of people's personal information, their pay, their social security numbers. So that something was big enough in itself. But the real thing that was eye-popping to us, and this was, of course, when I was in the Pentagon and was in the Situation Room for those 2 months when we're trying to figure out what to do in response to this, is it was a destructive attack. Sony's network was literally destroyed by this malware to the point that they were using pencil and paper and sending things back and forth via fax because they couldn't even operate their computers, more or less do email anymore. So you can imagine what it's like to be in Sony when like networks are down, people are leaking all this stuff, and you don't even have a computer anymore, and you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to do and how to respond. That's a whole different topic. The really important point here that y'all need to understand, though, is that the North Koreans have a very forward-leaning, aggressive perspective on the use of cyber operations that fits perfectly with their place in the world and their strategic calculus. This is even more the case now that it looks like they're increasing their capabilities to launch long-range missiles and possibly have one that would be able to develop a nuclear payload. Who can tell me why? Why is that? Why is the strategic calculus with cyber, knowing that they have some of these other capabilities, why does it fit so perfectly? How about you, sir, in the red tie? What's your thought on that? Red tie, red shirt.
Well, I guess they don't have a lot of other tools to rely on.
Okay, that's right.
And, this is a tool that they can use without spending a lot of money and without necessarily being detected.
Okay, thank you very much. Really important points. First of all, if you're the North Koreans and you actually do want to reach out and touch the US, you don't have that many options. You can try to do it via the US forces that are in the Republic of Korea, but you know, there's a little danger that that escalates in a way that's difficult to control. Otherwise, it's pretty hard, but if you have cyber as a capability from a lot of different places in the world, you can reach out, you can conduct an attack, and then the part that is very difficult for the US government right now is thinking about how to control that and respond to that without escalating to the point that it would come to a full-scale conflict. So, you know, here we are in the Situation Room with President Obama, and the president asks, amongst a whole bunch of other things, what are our options here? And you think, to start with, well, they basically have no internet, so we're not going to cyber them back. The internet they have mostly runs through China, which would mean if we were going to cyber them back, we may also inadvertently be attacking Chinese infrastructure, which is difficult from a foreign policy perspective. Diplomatic sanctions-wise, I think you all know there's very quickly diminishing returns on the number of sanctions you can put on. And then that means you have to think about outright military action, where you may have a show of force and some of the things that have been happening recently. But this is really hard. Imagine if there were a series of cyber attacks against the United States by North Korea, and it didn't stop, and he just kept on going right after it. You have to think about what the point would be when eventually the president would have to decide to do something that was going to escalate very quickly. It's something I'm very nervous about. I'd say also I'm nervous about the idea that there were a lot of bad guys around the world. I think just saw what happened during the elections of 2016, in which the Russians definitely went after the democratic system of government. I'm not saying that they changed it so much that it impacted the outcome. I think that would be going too far. But every bad guy around the world, I think, is like rubbing their grubby little hands now and thinking, there's another way to go after the Americans. That system is fragile. We should go after that too. So that's one of the things that we're working on up at the Kennedy School. So thinking about that, that's the fireballs from North Korea. So those are two of the most important dynamics when it comes to thinking about cyber in Asia. But I'm running a little bit behind, and I don't want to get the hook here from my gracious host. But I do want to talk really quickly about the other cyber actors in the region who are also important. And these are essentially the Cyber Five, as they're known. These are the most kind of prominent cyber actors. So that's Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. And for the purposes of this, I'm just going to briefly touch on Singapore, Japan, and Australia and give you a little bit of a sense of some things that are going on there. To start with, Deloitte last year released this report that said those Cyber Five are actually 9 times more vulnerable than anyone else in Asia. And it should make sense to you why. It's because these are highly developed economies. They're highly developed from a technology perspective. If you go to Japan nowadays, it makes you feel like the US is probably 30 years behind in terms of telecom, 5G, phone infrastructure, and their overall level of connectivity. Similarly, in other nations, they rely on the internet maybe even more than the United States. But when you think about Japan, this is something that also, from my humble American perspective, it makes me a little nervous. When I was the guy in charge of cyber at DoD, and then Abe, when he was in charge of Asia policy, we'd try to spend time with the Japanese. They recognized that there was a threat to their country that was a cyber threat, both from the Chinese and the North Koreans, in both of the ways that we discussed those. But I think you all know Japan as a country is going through a transformation right now where they're changing their constitution so that they can have a more assertive defense force in light of some threats that are going on. Also, this was fascinating to me, but in Japan until recently, they never even had a system for classifying information. It's like mind-boggling to someone. I've spent most of my career in the intelligence or national security field that there was never any way to even classify documents secret or keep control of it. So recently, they did pass a law that will start to put that in place. The reason it matters is nowadays when adversaries are going after sensitive information, you want to be able to protect the stuff that most needs protecting. So it's not stolen, leaked, doxed in some ways that I told you about. This is all progressing, I think, but it's something to watch. And I think it's also a really interesting area of study for students or scholars who are thinking about how this will all evolve, because they're at a phase where they're trying to build a cyber defense force, something like a cybercom, but almost certainly without the offensive component, defending their own networks, trying to figure out how to defend critical infrastructure. Moving on to Singapore, this is a really interesting country when it comes to cyber issues for a couple reasons. First of all, the geography of the internet is really important. And the geography of the internet when it comes to Singapore is even more important because a lot of major telecom hubs and those trans-Pacific cables land there, which means it's really a center of gravity for the internet. And that does actually matter. A lot of people have the idea that the internet is, this kind of ephemeral thing and it's not a physical being. That's not true. Singapore is really important for that. Singapore also very advanced in terms of technology and their dependence on technology for financial sector, shipping, a lot of other things. The Sings, I think, are very good at this. They early on were making investments in cyber defense, very forward-leaning perspective on protecting critical infrastructure. You all know, I'm sure, that the relationship between the government and the national security services and defense it's closer in Singapore than in other places in the world. So they can do some things, to me, that are kind of fascinating. And on the one hand, if you're thinking purely from a defense perspective, you think, man, I wish we could do that in our country. On the other hand, you realize the Constitution in the US means the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment are really important, and so we don't have a lot of the legal flexibility that they may. Finally, I just wanted to touch on Australia and just note that the Australians have identified cyber as really one of their most important priorities for national security and are also making great progress. Like the other two countries that I just talked about, the Australians recognize that their economy is very dependent on technology, the internet, and cybersecurity. And so the Australians have even made the strategic national decision that they want to export cybersecurity. They're proactively trying to develop firms and technology that will help improve this situation in Asia in particular, because they see two of these actors that are unpredictable, I guess is the one way to put it, in China and North Korea. And they recognize that they could do something about that. They've also recently passed pretty forward-leaning laws allowing them to protect their critical infrastructure, something that we've not been able to do in the United States at all. I think you all know there's been several pushes for cybersecurity legislation in the US that have never really gotten anywhere, mostly because private sector folks are concerned about some type of regulation. Personally, I don't think that's what it is. But the Australians have been able to do that, and that was spurred a lot because they were the target of attacks by a lot of state-based actors, the Chinese in particular, stealing intellectual property. Another thing they've done, which I think is really interesting, I don't actually know of another country that's been as forward-leaning, is the Australian Prime Minister recently announced that Australia was going to use its offensive cyber capabilities, and they're quite good. We work with them in war zones on going after terrorist cyber infrastructure, that they would use that to go after criminal organizations that had a major impact on the state of Australia. So on the one hand, I think that only seems fair. We would go after criminals in a lot of other domains. On the other hand, that can make some people nervous because the idea that there's an offensive organization going out and trying to take out the bad guys, so to speak, can be a little unsettling. Most people want the internet to be free, open, peaceful. The United States wants that too. I know the Australians do as well. But it was interesting. I don't know how much the Australians are doing this, but it's very interesting to me to see that and that have it be explicitly mentioned. And the Australians are also interesting because they have a named ambassador for cyber affairs. Recently in the US, we may have lost a little momentum in the State Department because there was an organization there that seemed to be functioning well. It's not clear why it happened, but that seems to have dissolved. So, you know, I wouldn't be a guy who tries to teach up at the Kennedy School if I didn't try to summarize what I think are the most important things that you should have learned. I apologize, I'm a little over time. I've got my clicker right here, and it worked. Thank you to the hardworking IT staff. So here I think are the key points that you should take away and that you should use to help you orient yourself when you're thinking about cyber in Asia. The first, like I mentioned, these are some of the most advanced digital countries in the world. They rely on the internet. They're developing and providing a lot of that technology. As we mentioned, for China, a core national interest is the control of information, and the Great Firewall of China is really the center of gravity for that, to make sure that to some degree they're able to control outside information and also protect themselves from perceived cyber attacks. At the same time, they'll use that capability to go on the offense to advance other foreign policy objectives. In North Korea, just like you heard from the audience, this is the perfect asymmetric tool for a rogue state that is looking to reach out and hurt the United States or hurt other allies in Asia. That's something we really need to watch over the next year in particular, as things may become more tense as they relate to some of the things they're doing with development of missile technology or nuclear technology. Cybercrime is a growing threat. I have not spent a lot of time in law enforcement, so we didn't emphasize that part. But because these are wealthy nations that are connected, the level of cybercrime is rising pretty quickly, and that's something that has a major impact. And we talked about those countries in particular who are most vulnerable and some of the things that they're doing. So in closing, I'd just like to thank you all again for the invitation. Thank you for being patient with me prodding you a little bit on the Socratic method. If it makes you feel any better, I was very mellow compared to what I do to my class, but they also have to read ahead of time, so it seems like I should be nice and not get run out of here. I think it's a great thing what FPRI and Woodrow Wilson Center are doing together. and I wish you good luck. Thanks. Oh, no, I'll take questions, but I don't want to. Yeah, okay. So I'm able to take some questions for a while, and I guess we can just go to whoever wants to raise their hand and ask something first. Or you may now be terrified that I'll ask you a question back. Why don't we go? Yes, sir, right here in the back corner.
I have a chance to retaliate for you asking me a question.
Yeah, right, exactly. See, I should have known better.
I'm frankly not sure how much you're able to say about this, but I'll put it out there, and then you can say I can't talk about it.
Okay.
David Sanger had a piece in the Times earlier this year that suggested that the United States had a very active, offensive program, internet cyber program, directed toward the North Korean missile and nuclear programs. I'm less clear how the DoD or other parts of USG responded to that particular article. But is there anything that you can say on this subject?
You're right. There's not a lot I can say on that specific issue. You'll be happy to know that David Sanger is also a teacher up at the Kennedy School, and he and I have a very friendly rivalry because the last 7 years when I was in charge of cyber, Sanger very often seemed to have stories that made my life much more complicated than I wish it would have been. So that's a good thing for students to learn, though, that there are important parts of the government that are not the Department of Defense and are the New York Times. This is one way to explain it. In the Department of Defense, there are 3 missions for Cyber Command, which over the last 7 years has developed now into a pretty capable organization, working with NSA and the other intel community members. One is just defending DoD networks. I told you this is a huge network. We have an IT budget of $38 billion. We spend $8 or $9 billion just on cybersecurity. It matters a lot for us to be able to operate. Second of all is a mission that is defend the nation, which is working with DHS and FBI to try to prevent major attacks against the country. That's a really hard mission. The third then is we do offensive cyber operations. And that is something when I first started 7.5 years ago, I wasn't even able to say that because it was classified. So the good news is now we want to be more transparent about the fact that we do offensive cyber operations. It's conducted under the law of armed conflicts, under international law, generally only used in cases in combat zones or areas of conflict, or when there's a really compelling national interest, because the internet is kind of the center of gravity for the United States, and we only very rarely would do something that may change the perspective on that, I think. So I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think, as you mentioned, you understand why I can't talk on that specifically. Yes, sir, there's a question down here, I think. Jim Lewis just showed up. He was a little late. He's an old friend of mine, so it's nice that I can call him out for.
10, so I could hear you, and it took a half hour to get here.
Okay, all right, you're still late. No, it was actually this gentleman right here. Don't give it to him. He'll ask something hard. Yes, sir.
Actually, I was just combining some thoughts
Okay.
in my mind, and I was going to ask you, when can we expect the great cyber famine?
Why don't you explain to me what you think about what do you mean by the famine?
The absence of cyber.
The absence of cyber, like the internet?
Intentional absence.
Yeah. Gosh, I have not thought about that, so this will be a little spontaneous, but I have always feared not only a big cyber attack, which I personally think won't be what everyone expects, which is the grid goes down and you don't have power. I think it will be something that has more to do with trust and confidence, and so that's why I'm really worried about the democratic systems we have and the electoral systems, because that's really based on trust. It could be the financial system where someone changes info in a way that really makes people wonder if when they place a trade it's actually going in, or there's something different and you can't really rely on what the markets are. And how this feeds into what you're saying is, I worry about that. What I worry more about is when the big one comes, what the counter reaction is in terms of locking things down, closing it off, and that could be something that would be very damaging. So, you know, it may sound counterintuitive, but I wonder if after the big one, the internet famine and the cyber famine isn't almost something that comes as a maybe exaggerated overreaction to a catastrophic like attack. You can imagine something like that, I think. That's a good question though. Any others? Yes, sir, right here.
Hello, my name is Chung Kyun. I'm an intern working in the Wilson Center in History of Public Policy program, and I also have experience in ROK Cyber Command for 2 years. So my question is, you mentioned about North Koreans' destructive cyber attack, but when I worked in Cyber Command in Korea, our focus was on the psychological warfare, like they're using the internet as a tool to promote their propaganda, also kind of promote causing inter-Korean conflicts using the internet.
Yeah.
So how do you see, in our we are a democratic country, so how do we defend those kind of from the fake news or the psychological propaganda, while we can also enhance our security?
Yeah, great, thank you. That's a really good question. First of all, thank you for what you're doing. We worked really closely with the ROC, the Republic of Korea Cyber Command. These guys are really good. They even had a Cyber Command-like organization established a little bit before the United States, and because of the threat there and how close the relationship is, we always work closely. Your question, I think, is a very good one, in particular when you see how the Russians so deftly have combined hacks with building a botnet that will manipulate Twitter feeds, drive certain news to journalists, and end up changing the way things come out. And I should just say, when I'm talking about this, it's not any partisan political perspective. I'm trying to objectively identify it as a security issue. I think the North Koreans, they're already very good at that. You know, just like the Chinese and the Russians, they're used to thinking about how to manipulate information and change people's minds and influence. And so I'm concerned about that too, in particular over the next electoral cycle, that they may do it in the US. You all definitely, you know, are on the receiving end of a lot of cyber attacks that have been pretty eye-opening. I just talked about the one for Sony, but in South Korea, they've suffered pretty major telecom attacks against their ATM infrastructure, against some media organizations. It's an almost regular occurrence now. Okay, all right, thank you all very much again. Thank you, it's really nice to be here. Thanks.
It's off to such a terrific start, and getting everybody woken up by the fear of being called on. So, let me call upon the members of our first panel to come up and join me here, and we'll get started in just a few minutes while we get everyone arranged up here.
You have to. I was going to say. Martin Lebicki, please. Hi, Martin.
Thanks so much for doing this. Sorry about the snafus on the communications.
What snafus?
Took forever. With the reply to your email, that's snafu.
Oh, no problem.
Anyway, but thank you. Do you want to go in the order on the program, or do you have a preference?
Martin should go first.
Because once Jim talks, I won't have anything left to say.
I was feeling the same way, but
I think we have you listed in,
alphabetical.
I don't know.
It really did take a half hour to get over here from 17th and M.
Yeah, we have
by car.
Martin, Jimmy,
taxi.
I
I had no idea what this.
We'll go in the order received. People a minute or two to drift back in.
Okay, guys, drift back in. Eric, how are you doing? Good to see you.
Oh, hi, Rachel. Good. Sorry.
Things are good?
I do. I don't have it. I'm hoping you do.
And I think of the implications. Yeah.
CSIS can close its deficit by getting Henry Kissinger to sing popular songs.
Okay. Okay, low stress.
Henry Kissinger to Frank Sinatra.
Is that on that?
Thank you, miss.
So well, we obviously got started late with everything, but this panel was longer. We thought we were going to have 4 panelists, and Liv Coleman can't make it here because of the hurricane.
Oh,
She's coming
yeah.
up from Tampa, and her flight's canceled. So a little illustration of how the afternoons.
Hurricane's a good excuse.
So we've got the full 90 minutes, which is what we usually do for a 3-panel thing.
Okay.
So we're good on time. And I'm going to get Rachel to start herding people back in.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. We have 12 students. I only see 4 votes.
He's really good at that. I don't know if you've ever seen him in action. We saw him here, but it's amazing. And it terrifies the audience. So, terrified me. So.
And you weren't even in for a grade.
That's right. Was I on a panel with him last night? Yeah. He's okay. You can talk more. Why don't you don't have an open mic? I like John Yoo. I thought he was good.
Who's also on?
Yeah, it was he and somebody else were rolling out a book on how warfare has changed. So they had me and
It's a guy named Strachan.
yeah.
Reading his book. It reminds me of those guys with the patches on his elbow and the pirate sitting on the Oxford Union. The book is like that. Decision strategy.
He's a bit more dynamic in real life.
Okay, while we're trying to herd people back in, I will do the part that no one really needs to listen to, which is the introductions. This is a panel that truly needs no introduction, and to the extent they are in the need of introductions, it's in your pamphlet, but I'll say a few words anyway. So this really, I think, is just a terrific group of people to address the topic we have before us on this first panel, which is cybersecurity threats and responses. I think we're going to go in the order listed in the program and in the order arranged on the stage here. So we'll start with Martin Libicki, who is an adjunct management scientist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School, as well as the distinguished visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He, like the other members of our panel, really is a leading figure in the cybersecurity field. He has written a great deal on information technology and national security issues, including books such as Cyberspace in Peace and War, which is forthcoming, Conquest in Cyberspace. It's out now? Okay. Oh, well, it's an old bio here. All right. So, Conquest in Cyberspace, yes, buy the book. So Conquest in Cyberspace, National Security and Information Warfare.
It's a classic.
There we go. Yeah. The movie rights will be sold soon. Getting to Yes with China and Cyberspace, Cyber Deterrence and Cyber War, and many other works, as well as Who Runs What in the Global Information Grid. His current research includes recent research includes net assessments of Russia and China in cyberspace, cyber war strategy, and organizing the U.S. Air Force for cyber war, and exploiting cell phones in counterinsurgency. So it's a wide range of work in this field. Following Martin, we'll have James Lewis. Jim Lewis is the Senior Vice President at CSIS in its Strategic Technologies Program and a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He has also worked in the U.S. Foreign Service, the Senior Executive Service, where he worked on many political military issues and has a rich history of negotiating experience, including the Cambodia peace process and the P5 talks on arms transfers, and of somewhat more immediate relevance here, perhaps led the U.S. delegation to the Wassenaar Agreement Experts Group, and has worked with the Southern Command, Central Command, and Central American Task Force. He's also been the rapporteur for the UN Group of Government Experts on Information Security, and has led a long-running Track 2 dialogue on cybersecurity with KICR, the China Institute for Contemporary International Relations, which, to those of you in the China biz, is really one of the quite interesting think tanks in the national security space. He has written enough pieces on these topics that I could spend the rest of our panel just listing the titles, but suffice it to say, many works on cybersecurity issues, cyber relations with China in particular, and also about cybersecurity questions more generally. And last but far from least, Jack Midgley is the Managing Director at Deloitte Consulting and a Senior Fellow in the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. He serves management clients in the global defense and intelligence communities, has worked in particular on Japan-related issues. He was based in Tokyo for several years, where he focused on the challenges confronting Japan's rapidly evolving Ministry of Defense, something we heard about in our morning session as well. And he's also worked on the western fringe of the area of the world we're talking about now, western fringe of Asia, where he was an Army civilian senior advisor to the Commander on International Security Assistance Forces. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for New American Security and has been an associate professor at West Point, where he directed the National Security Seminar, and is the author of Deadly Illusions, Army Designs for Nuclear Battlefield. I think I've got all that right, I hope. There's much more that could be said about each of my colleagues here, but they have far more interesting things to say than either I have to say or than their bios would occupy our time here. So let me just say one other thing, which is we have an illustration of something from the second half of our conference today, that is natural disasters and the consequences they have, and that Liv Coleman, who was supposed to be on this panel, could not get out of Tampa because the airport is closed. That has shrunk our panel from 4 to 3, so that we actually are pretty much on schedule because we'd allocated an extra 15 minutes for that panel. So we're sorry that Liv can't be with us today, but we've got 3 just really top flight people on this topic. So without my yammering anymore, let me turn it over first to Martin and then on to Jim and Jack.
So I can start yammering.
You can start yammering.
You mentioned a monograph that I had forgotten that I had written many, many years ago. And I want you to let you know how popular that monograph is. How popular it is, right? The first words of, oh, sorry. Oh, is that Mork? Yeah. Okay, the first words, oh boy, that is too loud. I don't hear myself that loud. The first words of the monograph are once upon a time. The last words of the monograph are happily ever after. And not one person has ever come up to me and said, you know that starting something with once upon a time and ending with happily ever after is the very definition of a fairy tale. So that's a statement about the readership of the stuff that I write for Rand. I want to start off with a preliminary question, because I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about or exploring the question, how good are North Korean hackers? Okay? As a rule, if you have an office automation system, which is the stuff that you folks use every day, that's connected to the internet, and your institution is not spending an unaffordable amount of money to secure it, pretty much it's not that hard to get into, right? So Sony, office automation systems, media companies, office automation systems. The North Koreans have broken into them. That doesn't mean they're particularly good. It just means that certain parts of our infrastructure are particularly weak. If, on the other hand, you spend a boatload of money protecting your cybersecurity institutions, as the U.S. Department of Defense does, as most of our financial companies do, or if you have taken care to isolate either all or a large chunk of your system and the bad guys get into it, then the bad guys are pretty good, right? Right now, we have enough evidence that the North Koreans are competent at cyber arts, but we don't have the evidence that these guys, that it makes you stand back and say, wow, these guys are spectacularly good. Okay, so let's do the bidding. As Eric had mentioned, Eric, the previous speaker, had mentioned, the North Koreans have had a certain amount of success getting into South Korean institutions. There was an attack, I believe, in early 2013 that goes by the moniker Dark Soul that saw the North Koreans getting into media
and certain elements of the South Korean banking system. There was enough of a cyber activity, I don't know if it was an attack or espionage, against the Republic of Korea's national identification system that the South Koreans had to redo or claimed they had to redo their national identification system because of these North Korean incidents. Okay, now take that one and put it to the side because I'm going to draw an important comparison. Okay, there was a North Korean hack on Sony. According to the filings at the Security Exchange Commission, take it for what you will, Sony claimed a $35 million loss over 2 quarters, basically in remediation costs. Now, one could say that the North Korean attack prevented people from seeing a movie. Having seen the movie, I'm not sure it would have earned $35 million on it, what it earned on its own. They say in Hollywood that no publicity is bad publicity, so I'll leave it at that, okay? Now, there was an interesting effect that took place that is rarely mentioned in the media, and that is that people were starting to get, however they do it in Hollywood, get their act together to shoot another film called Pyongyang that had Steve Carell in it at the time of the Sony attack, just after the Sony attack, that was canceled. So, in fact, yes, the Sony attack did have some implications for the U.S. freedom of speech, but I would also add, if you try to make a movie that shows the assassination of a litigious billionaire in the United States, you're also going to have problems, albeit of a somewhat different sort. Okay. What can we say about this? The United States has a mutual defense treaty with South Korea. The United States has pledged to come to South Korea's defense in case of an attack. Does a cyber attack count? That's a good question. Rhetorically, if you believe the United States public statements on it, a cyber attack does count. But it leaves open a question. What constitutes a sufficiently large cyber attack? This is not, by the way, a problem that we have in Connecticut to nearly the extent. For instance, if you had several, maybe even one, unchallenged North Korean soldier in South Korea that somehow South Korea couldn't deal with, I'm talking hypotheticals here, right? The United States would be obligated to help the South Koreans deal with the intruder. But in cyberspace, if you had to basically go to war with any country over the smallest cyber event, you'd be at war everywhere all the time because the small events are very frequent. So it becomes a real question in cyberspace, what constitutes something actionable? Well, we have 2 data points on this. One, the Sony attack, at least rhetorically, was actionable by the United States, and losses taken by the South Koreans, which were at least an order of magnitude higher, was not actionable by the United States. At some point, if we're going to take cyber and our alliances seriously, we're going to have to somehow reconcile these sorts of thresholds together. So let me put that one to the side, okay? However, the North Koreans have been getting particularly bold of late. You're all familiar with the fact that presumably North Koreans, and I think it was North Koreans, carried out an $81 million theft against the Bangladesh's version of the Federal Reserve Bank, okay? Was this event preventable? I would argue it was very preventable. Somehow the good folks who ran the bank believed in not spending more than $10 for used routers, so they could afford not to spend more, but somehow they could afford to get $81 million stolen from them. Maybe their priorities in retrospect weren't necessarily the best, okay? There was a North Korean attack called WannaCry, which was interesting from the fact that there's little evidence that they picked up as much as $100,000, but they caused a level of disruption that was several orders of magnitude larger. Okay, so what do we come out to? The North Koreans have an ability to cause mischief in parts of the world. It's not necessarily unpreventable mischief, but it so far has been unprevented mischief because the cost effectiveness of certain forms of defense against the North Koreans varies greatly depending on what you need to defend, okay? It's a challenge in cyberspace. Now, here's a question. Is this the most important thing we have to worry about from North Korea? And in that regard, I want a quote from David Sanger from the New York Times, which I think was kind of illustrative. He says there's another less dramatic interpretation of Mr. Kim's intentions. The combination of a developing nuclear program and his increasingly impressive cyber program may allow the North to very effectively get away with smaller provocations without fear of military retaliation. Mr. Kim paid very little price for the cyber attack that took out 70% of Sony Pictures Entertainment computer systems. 3 years ago, there was no retaliation for its attacks on South Korean banks and media companies, its suspected theft of money from the Bangladesh Central Bank, or its role in a recent attack that hit British hospitals with ransomware demands. In other words, WannaCry, okay? Well, let's look at the dollar figures here. All told, maybe North Korean attacks cost about $1 billion. What would the smallest nuclear attack cost? Okay? You know, we talk about wars. We have a hard time fighting wars and spending less than $1 trillion on it, whether you talk about Afghanistan or Iraq. I'm sure anything in South Korea would be easily top that amount. And, oh, by the way, cyber attacks have yet to kill anybody, so we can just sort of toss that comparison to the side. Okay? In other words, if, in fact, the North Koreans are taking us to the brink of nuclear war so that they can carry out cyber attacks, my response is, you know, don't throw me in that briar patch. Whatever you do, don't throw me in that briar. Now, am I making reference to really old literature that no one has read? Brer Rabbit, does that sound familiar? Okay, it does to some of you folks, not other folks. Okay. The moral of the story is that's exactly what the rabbit wanted to have done, because the rabbit was very familiar with how to deal with briar patches. And by the same token, we're fairly familiar with how to deal with cyber attacks and modulating, if not necessarily minimizing, their losses. Okay. Do we want to necessarily carry out cyber attacks against North Korea? Well, as Eric pointed out, they're a really hard target to go after. Okay, and one of the reasons that they are a hard target is that North Korea has spent an enormous amount of money keeping other people from extracting large costs on them. Okay, they have borne large costs in order to get a position that makes it difficult for other people to impose costs on them. And so it's not only North Korea's low connectivity and relatively low level of digitization that has protected North Korea, it's also the fact that they hold a Damocles sword over South Korea in both conventional and, more recently, nuclear capabilities. So you end up thinking, if this is the worst North Korea can do, is to use their nuclear capabilities as a cover for carrying out cyber mischief, we have really dodged a large bullet. And rather than complain, we should be pretty thankful. Now, if this is a good excuse for us to get more serious, or for the South Koreans to get more serious about the cybersecurity business, that may not be an entirely bad thing, okay? There are lots of things we could do to make ourselves more secure that we have foolishly not done. But in the scheme of things, I'd rather take, you know, a cyber attack 8 days a week than the threat of a nuclear attack once a year.
Great. Well, thank you.
You can see I had to rewrite my remarks extensively after Martin, so.
Did you read my email?
No, I did read your email, but
I didn't believe it.
I didn't believe it, that would be true. So as you heard, I think from all the speakers, the technologies that make up cyberspace are inherently vulnerable. And a key point to bear in mind is this won't change anytime soon, and there really aren't any technological fixes. Sometimes you hear about Cyber Manhattan Project or a Cyber Silver Bullet or something, and all, it's just complete nonsense. And in part because any technology that improves our position will also improve the opponent's position. It just is a balance here. Governments see cyberspace as a largely unconstrained area for action, and two of them in the region we're talking about, Russia and North Korea, are both active and actively support cybercrime. In Russia, it's through proxies. In North Korea, it's state entities. And one thing that always annoys me is that the PR divisions of cybersecurity firms come up with cute names for the, you know, like Hairy Bear or Lazarus Group or who knows, you know, Brer Rabbit. People don't call themselves these things. The Chinese use numeric designators It's RGB and some other subunits within the. So it doesn't help us to complicate the debate by coming up with cute names that are better suited for soda pop. The most dangerous opponents in cyberspace are states, right? And we can largely dismiss the idea that non-state actors will launch massive and damaging cyber attacks. This is an ever popular theme in the discussion. It dates back to the reviews that occurred after the end of the Cold War, where people tried to identify what the next threats to US security would be. The fact that we're now entering our 25th year without having seen any of these things is a hint. In interviewing the heads of various US and foreign intelligence agencies, all of them agree that non-state actors do not have the capability to launch damaging cyber attacks at this time. And then you can have a debate about how long it will take for them to acquire this. US figures will often say they don't have it now, but they'll have it within 2 or 3 years. I would believe that more if I hadn't first been told that in 2011. So this is a state-to-state activity for the most part. Yes, there's crime. Yes, there's disruption. Yes, there's political activity. But from a strategic perspective, you're looking at states. States use cyber attack for purposes that are consistent with their larger doctrines and strategy. This is a new tool. It doesn't mean they've significantly changed what their goals are or what they're doing to pursue those goals, right? They manage the risk of using cyber activities by staying below, and I think you heard this from both Eric and Martin, staying below the threshold of what could be regarded as the use of force. So what can I do that's coercive yet does not create the risk of triggering a potential military response? And you see experimentation with that, judging largely from where opponents judge the reaction of the US in particular, but also our allies, and say, how much can I get away with? Oh, that one went a little too far, I'll back it off. So we're in an iterative process here where people seek to avoid warfare, but do want to use cyber techniques for coercive purposes. Effect is exaggerated. I think Eric said this at the end, but you have not seen any deaths as a result of cyber attack. I'm not sure you've seen any casualties as a result of cyber attack. You've seen destruction in a handful of incidents, perhaps 3 or 4, right? And damage in a few others. There is a gray area. Physical damage, exceptionally rare. Damage to intangible assets, much more likely. So it's a different kind of ballgame. But of course, our laws for conflict are designed for physical damage. It's easy to tell when a bomb drops on a building or a tank drives over a border. Much more difficult in this kind of activity. But we don't want to think of it. I hope no one said Cyber Pearl Harbor, but if they say Cyber Pearl Harbor, it's a good indicator that they don't know what they're talking about. What do people do? They engage in crime, or they tolerate crime. At least 2 of the states, Russia and North Korea, provide sanctuaries for cybercrime. They engage in espionage. We, of course, do that too. Espionage is the original cyber sin, and it continues to be perhaps the most active. And finally, you see them using it for political coercion. And in this way, the US may not be the leader. The Russians are probably the leader in thinking, how do I use cyber technique to achieve cognitive effect, to change how people think? Yes, most advanced militaries are developing offensive cyber capabilities, but we have largely not seen them used. It will be part of warfare should there actually be a war, but absent armed conflict, people will try and stay below this threshold. IP theft is also exaggerated, the consequences of IP theft. If I spend $1 billion to invent a square wheel, how much is that wheel worth? Well, the answer is 0, right? Or if I steal your IP and I don't know how to make anything out of it, I don't know how to make a competing product, then the damage from the theft is still 0. Of course, there's the insult to sovereignty, right? And so we were all insulted by the fact that we're all tromping over each other's networks, but it's probably not the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. It's well under $1 trillion. It's probably under half a billion globally, right? So in a $75 trillion global economy, losing, 500 billion is just not a big deal, right? So we don't want to exaggerate it. The one area that might be a useful counter to that point is China's acquisition in the decade following 2000 of advanced U.S. military technology, including nuclear weapons technology, was exceptionally damaging. That would be the most salient example of damage from IP theft. In Asia, the cyber challenges are predicated by the larger security environment, the larger political environment. They're also predicated on the general decline in international stability as the U.S. influence recedes. This occurred before the last two administrations, so it wasn't a partisan remark. But cyberspace and cybersecurity are not exogenous to the larger security environment, right? It's shaped by and determined by that environment, and states use cyber techniques to advance their political objectives, right? There's wide disparity, as you probably heard, among Asian nations. And I'd say perhaps only 3 or 4 have what you would consider even moderately advanced capabilities. The rest of them are at a very, very low stage of development. And that, of course, shapes the environment in some ways. In that if you have, it's not the one-eyed man is king in the kingdom of the blind, but it's close to that. It points to what could be done in Asia to reduce risk, and that could include capacity building, further progress on confidence building measures, and there's been work in the ASEAN Regional Forum and in APEC on these two things, and then finding ways to cooperate in law enforcement and the prosecution of cybercrime. These are things that I think certainly Southeast Asian nations are aware of and are working on. In Northeast Asia, the political conflicts between China, North Korea, Japan, the US, Russia, limit the ability to move forward on a cooperative agenda. The Chinese still say they like to cooperate, and perhaps we can figure out a way to do it, but it may not happen soon. Our alliances in Asia have all been adjusted to take cybersecurity into account, so it's been added to the alliances with Australia and Japan. We're developing cooperative techniques to exercise jointly to share information. But again, this is also at an early stage in embedding cybersecurity into the alliance structure. It's a good thing, and it's something that our opponents can't match. I met the guy who came up with the term BRICS, and I said to him, "Why do you call them BRICS? Why is Russia in there? It's in decline. It's sort of the Mexico of the North." In fact, that's an insult to Mexico to compare them to Russia. And he said, well, we couldn't call them BICS, right, because that's already copyrighted. So he needed to throw Russia in. But it's not a very powerful alliance. I'm not making that up. It's not a very powerful alliance. It's not, although the Russians would like it to be sort of a quantum NATO, and it's billed that way sometimes, it's in no way comparable. And the tensions between Russia and China often go unremarked. They prefer to present a united front and imply that they're cooperating against the U.S., when in fact there's deep distrust between the two alleged partners. Some interesting questions to think about might be, how do we accelerate confidence building and capacity building in Asia? The U.S. was paying more attention to this previously, but is now largely backed out of that, at least temporarily. We could ask, how will Chinese doctrine change in the light of Russian successes in cyber operations? And that's one I think a lot of people are wrestling with. So the Russians have been doing this kind of thing for more than a century. If you think about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that was a Russian intelligence service creation. The rumor that AIDS was from Fort Detrick, Russian intelligence services. Very, very skillful, very knowledgeable of how to influence Western societies. I'm not sure the Chinese can match that. And so when you look at telling people that Xi Jinping thought is important lacks persuasive clout. But the Chinese have realized they need to expand their soft power. They may attempt to see how the Russians have used cyberspace to do that. Might be a good place to stop. I had one more and I can't remember what it was. So
if you do, I'll give you a chance to come back to it.
thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start with the observation that cyber is really just another domain for defense policy. It's just land operations, sea operations, nuclear operations. Now we talk about cyber. It's another place in which we conduct military operations. And I've noticed, maybe you have too, that when people start to plan, I think we want to skip to a different file.
That's Eric's slide.
That's a really good one, but it's already been used. Yeah. I've noticed that when defense planners start to think about operations in some kind of a domain, air or nuclear or ground, they always like to start with a map. But getting maps, that's a wrong file, friend. Would you put the other file up? To get a map in cyberspace, particularly in East Asia, it's a little bit tricky. And what I thought I'd try to do today is take a little risk and show you 3 different maps of East Asia in cyberspace. I'm going to tell you about how we built these maps and why they are still very primitive. But at the same time, all 3 of those maps point to exactly the same conclusion about the state of cyber risk in East Asia. They point to something that I think was already mentioned by Eric, and that's the idea of asymmetric vulnerability. Countries in East Asia don't present the same level of vulnerability. It's not a uniform level of vulnerability to cyber attack. We think that's a big deal because if you believe that deterrence is important in cyber policy, asymmetric vulnerability is a big challenge for policymakers. So what I'd like to do is a couple of things, and I'm going to do this very quickly to give you lots of time for discussion and comment. I want to show you these very flawed maps of cyberspace in East Asia. Then I want to suggest what it might mean for planning cyber policy, both by East Asian defense ministries and by the United States. And then we can go from there. While we're getting these maps up, let me tell you what you're about to see. I'm going to show you three different maps. They're really simple. The first map shows the conventional internet, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. The second map looks at the Internet of Things. The third map looks at the social media aspects of the Internet. And what we're doing is we're comparing the vulnerability of each of the Asia-Pacific countries in each one of those domains. I'm really glad that we have a large group of students here because I'm absolutely sure that when students look at these constructs and how they were put together, you're going to be able to figure out some ways to improve these maps and make them even better. Now, I've set a great deal of expectation around these maps, and I'm really hoping that I can show them to you. To put the first, we'll look at it in a minute. Here's why I'm telling you that these maps are still kind of primitive. Let's talk first about the conventional internet. That one's pretty easy to map. What we did is in each country in Asia Pacific, we simply we simply got some data on the number of total internet users, the number of total mobile broadband subscribers, the number of secure servers. There's a military expression for what those things are in cyberspace. Those things are called targets. Those are things that can be attacked by a malicious actor in cyberspace. Secure servers, individual broadband subscriptions, that is, an individual cell phone, an individual internet user. The more of those per capita in a particular country, the more vulnerable that country is to attacks in cyberspace. Now, to get that data, thank you. To get that data, we're restricted to using publicly available information. And colleagues, this is information that you can easily get. We use the World Bank, World Development Indicator data to map the conventional internet. So let me show you the first map. It doesn't even look like a map because it's not geography. This is a look at the traditional internet in East Asia, and what it shows is an index. The global average is 100, and the value of 100 corresponds to the average internet use per capita in 197 countries worldwide. So 100 is the average for the whole world. What jumps off the page to me is the fact that South Korea is completely off the scale. There's kind of South Korea, and then there's everybody else. Well, ubiquitous wireless has a lot to do with that. Multiple cell phones per Korean has a lot to do with that. Okay, the South Korea is, in per capita terms, the heaviest internet user in the world, therefore in cyber terms, the most exposed country in the world. That's a little bothersome, but what's really bothersome is the bottom part of the chart. Korea scores 503 on that index score. Look at Russia, China, India, Pakistan, DPRK, a full order of magnitude below in terms of internet use. What that tells us as defense planners is that the vulnerability is very different. Well, so what? We're going to talk about the so whats after I show you two more maps. But in terms of the conventional internet, the traditional internet, there is a tremendous asymmetry in national vulnerability across Asia. And we think this might pose a particular problem for deterring cyber attacks. So that was the traditional internet, and when we showed this to some defense officials, they said, yeah, that's very nice, we understand that, but what we're really interested in is the Internet of Things. What's happening on the Internet of Things? That's the Internet of devices, that is, not your telephone, not your home PC. This is your router, your webcam. But the Internet of Things also includes factory automation systems, the systems that are used to control robots and industrial machinery, that is, to control the industrial and commercial heart of a national economy. It can also include, for example, things we found during our search, like the valves that control large oil storage tanks in harbors. These technologies are increasingly being connected to the internet. And because some of them are not very well secured, we and you are able to find them. To map the Internet of Things, we used a commercial search engine. You're probably very familiar with it. The tool is called Shodan. If you aren't familiar with it, you should get that way, because the results that you can generate with Shodan are quite terrifying. Shodan is to the Internet of Things what Google is to the indexed internet. Okay, so we looked at the traditional internet, and you see this very asymmetric picture. Now here's the picture that we get for the Internet of Things. And we put two different kinds of systems on here. One was industrial automation systems, one is home. If you want the details about how we put these queries together, I can share them with you individually. But once again, Korea is at the top of the list, and by a very long margin. And that score is driven not so much by commercial automation, factory automation, but by home automation systems, webcams, DVRs, set-top boxes, so forth. Why is that a problem? It's a problem for two reasons. One, those targets can be attacked directly. If they're exposed to the internet, they can be attacked and service can be denied. Well, okay, so you lost your webcam or you lost your DVR. No big deal. The second thing is these points on the internet are not just targets, they can also be used as weapons. The last year's attack in the United States, the Dine Mirai distributed denial of service attack, was conducted by taking over home automation systems like DVRs and set-top boxes, and then using those systems to launch an attack against the Dine domain name service provider. So those systems are both targets and weapons that can be exploited by a bad actor on the internet. Well, just as with the traditional internet, on the Internet of Things, we seem to be seeing a tremendous amount of asymmetric vulnerability. There's a couple of countries at the top and a couple at the bottom. Once again, the Russians, the Indians, the Pakistanis, relatively low. But you might notice, and maybe we can talk about this later, some strange countries at the top. I don't mean that they're strange countries. I mean it's strange that they're at the top. One might not have expected to see Vietnam close to the top here. One might not have expected to see Japan relatively close to the bottom. What's going on here? In Japan, industrial automation is generally custom built and does not include open internet ports that are used for upgrades and service. So you see much lower levels of internet exposure in Japan than you do in Korea, which tends to use commercially available systems from companies like Siemens that have these kind of open ports. So just as you saw with the commercial internet, you see asymmetric vulnerability on the Internet of Things. That's a problem. We're going to talk about why that's a problem in a second. More recently, people have been asking us, what about national vulnerability to social media attacks? This one is harder for us to think about, and I'm not sure we have it right. But let me show you what we've done to try to quantify relative levels of national vulnerability to social media attack. Here's our thinking. To be vulnerable to attack through an information operation on the internet, two things have to be true. One, a very large fraction of your population should use social media. If they're not on social media, you can't use social media to mount the attack. But that's not enough. You also have to live in a country where those types of operations can be made effective on the government. That is, there has to be a high level of citizen participation in government. Those were our working hypotheses. Now you can question the merits of those two if you like. When you apply those two, here's what we got. We calculated we composed a simple index using social media use, that is the fraction of the population that is actively using social media, not just Facebook, Weibo, Pengyo, VKontakte, LinkedIn, Twitter, the whole gamut of social media, because different countries use different software sites. So that's a representation of the fraction of the country that's on the internet in social media. The second number, we used the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. And we just created an index combining those two values. When you do that, once again, just as with the traditional internet and the Internet of Things, you see tremendous asymmetry in national vulnerability. At the top, maybe the countries you might have expected to see: New Zealand, South Korea, Australia. There's the US for comparison, and also Singapore. At the bottom, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Pakistan, and at the very bottom, North Korea. Okay, 3 different maps: conventional internet, Internet of Things, social media exposure. In all 3 cases, tremendous asymmetry in vulnerability. What does this mean for defense planning, for cyber in East Asia? Well, it means the countries at the bottom have a very strong incentive to strike the countries at the top in areas where they cannot be hit back. If you are Pakistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, information operations against these countries make a lot of sense, because a proportional response in cyberspace is impossible. If you turn the picture the other way, from the standpoint of a defense planner in these countries, if you are building cyber policy based on proportional response in cyberspace, our findings would suggest that the actual efficacy of that policy may prove to be very low. So we need to do a lot more work on refining these numbers. These are very simplistic. We're using public data. And someone's going to point out these are all just measures of gross vulnerability. We're just counting targets. We're not taking into account the defensive mechanisms that different countries have put into place. We don't know how to do that. But when you do nuclear target planning, you count targets. When you're doing conventional force planning, you look at what forces the enemy has arrayed against you, what the potential targets are. That's the analogy to this very simple-minded approach that we've taken here. But in all three domains of cyberspace, the answer is the same, and it's equally troubling. So I'll look forward to your improvements and critique of these very simple approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for really giving us a lot of terrific questions and information ideas to chew on, and for keeping to time. So we actually do have quite a good chunk of time for discussion and question and answer. So first, does any of you want to respond to anything others of you have said? Nope. Okay, I guess we can throw it open for questions. I believe Rachel and Tom have microphones, so we've got one down here in the front. Right, down the front corner.
Actually, I have the shotgun approach, but I'll ratchet it back to some simple ones. Shodan, is that S-H-O-D-A-N?
Yes, shodan.io.
Okay, and that's one of the lower realms of martial art experience, professional. Shodan, Nidan, Sandan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
You got me.
So when I think of Shodan, I think you guys are just at the beginning.
I'll take that point. We are definitely at the beginning.
The rock being so predominant in Internet of Things, social media, et cetera, when I look at the population of Republic of Korea, and I look at those numbers up there, I think you pointed it out that people have a plethora of IT-related bits and pieces in their homes. And the reason why that might seem, it seems unique to me, but it seems that it's an economic thing for Korea. Korea is producing stuff that everybody who's got little fingers wants to have. And the only way they can remain a nation in the public eye from the standpoint of a successful nation is to keep producing these things so that they sell more. They stay up there purposely. It's an intentional thing. Whereas other countries aren't interested in the industrial wealth that's generated from having all of these gadgets.
I'm not enough of a sociologist to know, to evaluate that statement. I don't know. I think what the enabler has been government policy and an investment approach that has emphasized ubiquitous access to the network, and it's encouraged people to be hyper-connected, and factories have followed suit. Companies like Samsung, all the chaebol, have emphasized internet-based technology, so they've clearly made their bet, and it's showing up, as we saw.
The question for Mr. Lewis is a result of a radio talking head show on NPR of about 2 weeks ago. One of the presenters was a naval, I think a former naval officer, and they were talking about some comment that the president made about a 400-pound cyber geek sitting on a couch in New Jersey being responsible for the McCain.
Yeah, that was Chris Christie.
I knew he was talking about Chris Christie, but the fact that he mentioned that, but the naval person in the panel on the radio program said that couldn't happen to the Navy because of the systems that the Navy have or has, but it could happen on the commercial side, and he left it hanging in the air. So I'm asking Mr. Lewis, is it possible to take control of, and it was mentioned that oil refineries and tanks, storage tanks are operated using the internet. Can somebody take control of the navigation of a tanker, be it a cargo ship with containers or a fuel tanker in the Straits of Malaga? 2 instances where U.S. naval boats were rammed.
And so Martin might want to chime in on this as well, but and strangely enough, I have people doing independent research with me at the Naval Academy this year, this semester, and that's one of the research problems, is how do you defend against cyber attack in a complex navigational environment? The topic was suggested to me by Mike Asante, who is one of the world's leading experts on this. And the answer is the two incidents did not involve hacking in any way. They reflect other problems in the Navy. But it's possible, particularly for commercial ships. And so when you look at what is being, how much is now run online, so that big commercial ships don't actually navigate themselves anymore. They're navigated from their home port or their home company over satellite links. And you could think of many ways you could possibly interfere with that. I don't believe there's been any incidents. The North Korean, there might have been one. And the North Koreans try to do things like this every once in a while, but it's certainly a place that people are looking about and thinking that we need to make more secure. The other one is aviation. I met the guy who claimed to have hacked into United Airline. He's really great. You met him this summer too.
The
he's
Scottish fellow.
He's like 7 feet tall. He has a bright blue beard of this color. He wears a leather kilt and combat boots. But so he looks like a hacker, but people tell me that he probably is exaggerating his success, but it's enough that the airlines have set up their own sort of working group to look at cyber vulnerabilities. So have we seen incidents? No. Is it a risk? Yes.
I want to make a comment here. People have been worried about cyber 2-3 decades. People have been doing electronic warfare since the 40s. The GPS signal, the civilian signal, is notoriously weak. It's easy to jam. People do it all the time, often by accident. The North Koreans, as Jim pointed out, have been playing with jamming GPS or spoofing GPS along the North Korean-South Korean border. And there's some evidence that the Russians are playing with that in the Black Sea. So don't blame cyber for some older problems having to do with electronic warfare. Satellite uplinks are also fairly easy to jam. Downlinks are harder, but has to do with the geometry of satellites. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities that don't have cyber in them to the globe's communications information system.
When we looked at when we got the Shodan search results, produced hundreds of thousands of internet-exposed devices worldwide, inside Russia, inside North Korea, many inside China. And I was shocked. I didn't think that a simple public tool would provide the level of access. And unlike Google, Shodan returns more than just a result. In more than half of the cases that when we get an internet-exposed system identified through Shodan, we're invited to log in to that system. Now you have to know how to do that, and I guess there are people who do know how to do it. We didn't. But these systems, the IoT systems, are at a shocking level of openness and accessibility. And they haven't been widely exploited yet, I guess. You did see, Dine Mirai used millions of systems last year. There have been smaller ones. But the level of overall exposure of these new devices on the internet, I think, is not well appreciated by the public. It may not even be fully appreciated by some militaries. But it's very open and alarmingly so.
Okay, I want to go to the back row there. There are 2 questions.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. It was really interesting. I have a question primarily for James Lewis, but I would be really interested in everyone's perspective on this. So I'm particularly interested in U.S.-China relations and specifically the new Chinese cybersecurity law and the ways in which the data localization policies have encouraged companies like Apple to set up joint ventures in which that are primarily owned by Chinese companies, and therefore that creates a kind of fluidity between the data storage services of Apple and Chinese companies, which frequently are set up in conjunction with the Chinese government. So I'm thinking of like Guizhou Yunxiang and its relationship with the Guizhou government. So what I'm particularly interested in is how, because James, you specifically mentioned this question of intellectual property theft and how that in itself is, a relatively minor concern within the context of the larger global economy. But when this is combined with commercial vulnerabilities and cybersecurity, how do these things interact, and what are the kind of larger implications as you see them?
That's a good question. I think China has complementary policies, some of which date back to the Snowden revelations, and some of which, of course, predate it. So there's been a long concern about their vulnerability because of their reliance on U.S. technology. China Academy of Science expert told me in 2007 that the U.S. builds a backdoor into every computer chip that it could trigger in the event of war. So I told him he was nuts. I don't think we've talked ever since then, but it's a long-standing belief. And so that's complemented, however, by their even longer-standing trade policies to develop the indigenous industries that will end their reliance on Western products. And I think the goal under President Xi has been expanded to not only end their reliance on Western products, but to supplant Western manufacturers. And Huawei is the poster child for this. Creation of state champions in China through subsidies, non-tariff barriers to trade, other sorts of non-WTO compliant actions is reinforced or intertwined with the security case. For Western companies, it's very difficult, and you see a high degree of ambivalence. They want to be in the China market. The China market is important for them. The Chinese know this and exploit it. They will tell you that they know Western companies are dependent. That's in their view on the China market. I think that's an overstatement, but it gives them the sense that they can push companies to do more. And so when it comes to joint ventures, or when it comes to security requirements, I think they're interlocking policies. And so you want to have a cloud service provider in China, you can't, right? It has to be a Chinese company. The best you can get away with is a joint venture where you're the junior partner, and you may be required to share your source code. You have to be compliant with Chinese law. You may be strongly encouraged, I think they invite you to drink tea if you know what that means, strongly encouraged to locate the data within China. Now, other countries are pursuing similar policies, but in China's case, the combination of very nationalistic industrial policy, well-resourced, and with the intention of displacing Western companies, and their larger cybersecurity concerns, which are a bit irrational. I don't really care where you locate the data. If I want to get access to it, I'm going to get access to it. And there's 4 or 5 countries that can make that statement. But you see this mutually complementary policy in China that uses cybersecurity at least as a cover.
If I just follow up, since we're on this China segment here, to what extent is the attempt to have the Huaweis and the ZTEs become providers to the world this technology undercut by fears that they're putting the back doors in? That is, that Chinese fear is mirrored by those who might buy from China. And secondly, on the sort of politics of this, do you see in China the emergence of the kind of the sense of the kind of information that Jack's presentation brought through, the sense of Chinese vulnerability as becoming a political justification for the internet choke points, for an even more rigid firewall, if you will? So
it's a good question about Huawei and ZTE. I think that there's some countries that don't care about security, that would be the majority of them. There's other countries that are strongly tempted by the various financial incentives that Huawei and ZTE can offer. And Huawei and ZTE both make good products now. And whether 10 years ago that involved the theft of intellectual property, it doesn't involve it now. They make good products at lower prices, and their exports are subsidized by the Chinese government. Why wouldn't you buy it? And so I think what you're seeing is sort of the developing world market tilting in their direction. In countries that are part of NATO or are US allies, there's a bit more reluctance, but not necessarily enough reluctance to stop. I'm trying to do a little bit of measurement of Chinese soft power now, and an initial conclusion is forget soft power, think hard cash, right? And money does make the world go round. But it's good stuff too. I mean, if you're a company, and I've heard American companies say this, and you have a company that delivers 100% quality, a product that delivers 100% quality, and a product that delivers 80% quality but comes at 2/3 of the cost, you know which one you're going to pick. So a successful strategy. What was the second one?
Well, it was just a question of, yes, yeah. So there is, as you know, ongoing issues in China about how much to keep the Great Firewall in place, tighten it or loosen it. I'm wondering if the politics of the political impact of some of the things that Jack's talking about, the sense of vulnerability is you see it being used as a way to justify internally in China the retention or even enhancement of restrictions on relatively free information flow, or to support their general argument about internet sovereignty internationally.
So I'm going to be on a panel with Fang, the inventor of the Great Firewall, in a couple weeks. And I love Fang because he still wears a Mao jacket. It's like, dude, what century are you in? And the answer to that would be, in any case, Fang's a lot of fun. Not the friendliest guy in the world. But I think the Chinese do have a sense of their reliance on the internet now, and particularly when you think about telecom, finance, aviation, they know that those are very vulnerable sectors. The other vulnerability is, of course, the greatest concern of the Chinese government is their own population, and controlling that, and the political effect of the internet undercuts that control. So there's experimentation in China, both in developing the technologies, that would be Fang's department, developing the technologies that allow them to extend political control, and coming up with the policies and some of these industrial policies that allow them to reduce the political risk from the internet. So I think they've come quite a long way, and having talked to them now for about a decade about this, they have a very different perception of risk. Sovereignty is the idea that sovereignty was going to go away and the world would be one big happy place of all market democracies. These were delusions of the 1990s, and the Chinese have gotten over it, but so have the Germans, right? So I think now people are exploring what a sort of post-American internet will look like, and the Chinese are aware of the issues, investing in ways to go around it. And the goal, of course, is to minimize political risk without harming commercial activity. I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off, but that's the goal.
If anyone else want to weigh in on these questions we got? No. Okay, so there's another one in the back row, and then we'll come down front for the next one.
Yeah, Ken Meyercourt. Thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that the CIA has developed the capability to engage in an attack and misdirect investigators as to where that attack came from. Should we assume that other countries have developed that capability, and how does that complicate the situation?
Of course they've developed that capability. I mean, cyber espionage, cyber attack are not unique American techniques. A lot of countries have done that, and a lot of countries are...
But hiding the origin, who did the attack?
Well, a lot depends on how badly you want to hide the origin, okay? You often find out that when you do attribution, oh yes, this code looks like they keep business hours that look like the business hours in Moscow, or they keep business hours that look like the business hours in Beijing, or they use a particular keyboard, or they don't. Obfuscating the keyboard, obfuscating the business hours, going on the international market. They're all things that a lot of folks can do if they have the interest in obfuscation. Okay, I think the American intelligence community has a higher interest in obfuscation because they're more professional than the other guys who sometimes come across as talented amateurs. But yeah, they could do it if they wanted to.
But none of the major incidents that we've talked about can be seen as a successful false flag operation. I mean, you know, using a cutout is just traditional tradecraft, so it's not a big deal. But any of the ones we've talked about, Sony, Stuxnet, Aramco, the Central Bank of Bangladesh, what a strange target. All of them are without doubt, the attribution in all of these incidences and others is correct. Russian hacking of the DNC, there shouldn't be any doubt. North Korean hacking of Sony. It's just.
The report?
Which report?
The report that we haven't gotten to see about Russian hacking of the DNC.
I would feel confident that it was Russia. I would feel very confident. Just watching the Russians gloat over it is enough of it. the little buzzards.
They're artists. Isn't that what Putin said?
Yeah. No speculation on their weight, however.
Okay, we have two in the front row here. Let's go there and there. We're getting microphones to you.
My name is Mustafa Malik. I have come to learn about cybersecurity, but I am interested in international affairs research, especially in South Asia. Now, Mr. Meagley mentioned about cyber deterrent. My question is about nuclear deterrent. I was in Pakistan at a seminar, and the question came up that isn't the United States more interested in denying the nuclear deterrent to smaller countries like North Korea and Pakistan? Because the MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction Doctrine, doesn't apply to these small countries. And why would they commit national suicide, making a first use of nuclear weapon, even if Iran has it or North Korea? And after Iraq war, it is evident that if Iraq had nuclear weapons, it could have avoided a disastrous war. So is it not that the United States want to deny them the deterrent, the capacity to protect themselves from U.S. attack, that they raise the hue and cry about Iran going to get a nuclear weapon or North Korea? Why would they commit national suicide? Now, I am not familiar with the nuclear doctrine, and so I could not give an informed answer. I don't know if any of you would like to take it. Thank you.
Well, a couple points. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union both possessed nuclear weapons. That did not prevent them from engaging in conflict with each other. It would be a different kind of conflict. But I think that any nation that thinks that acquiring a nuclear weapon will prevent them, particularly when they are in routine violation of international norms and treaties, will prevent them from suffering the consequences is sadly deluded, right? And I wonder about the concept of holding the U.S. Hostage with a single nuclear weapon. At one point I worked for an individual named James Baker. I think his response would have been, we will turn your country into a glowing glass plane if you launch even a single nuclear weapon. And I think that threat still holds. So yes, it does change the form of conflict because there are different kinds of approaches, but it doesn't mean the end of conflict, nor does it give countries. Eric's point is a good one, and I'm sure if you look at the North Korean nuclear program, it was a missile program. They were accelerated after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. but the North Koreans are deluding themselves if they think it gives them invulnerability.
Anyone else? Okay. I've got another question right here.
Thank you. Tristan Martinez, Texas A&M University. So South Korea's internet penetration was accomplished with popular and industrial support, but also heavy government guidance. What possibilities for security controls did the South Korean government miss out on? And if America would attempt such an infrastructure project, what should security policymakers push for?
Well, in the IoT case, which I think is probably the most instructive, the South Korean government, like most governments, does not regulate password standards, security standards, or anything like that for devices connected to the internet. The EU explored, and it may still be exploring, some regulatory approaches, essentially an underwriter's laboratory-like approach for devices that are going to be connected to the internet. But even simple measures like allowing password changes or firmware upgrades could be helpful. But in the rush to get these devices to market, security just has not been a fundamental concern. And I think it's the pace of adoption rather than a failure of regulation that produces the vulnerability picture that you see here. I don't know if, and my colleagues may be able to describe this better, I don't know what the long-term prospects are for the EU's regulatory effort. It's not popular, and it's likely that even if it's successful, it's likely to take the form of guidelines rather than any kind of a firm recommendation. Am I addressing your question, sir?
Well, let me take a crack at it. There are two incidents that people have worried about in Korea. One was the reports, and I will use the word reports advisedly, that the North Koreans had gotten into South Korea's nuclear reactor. Another were reports that they had gotten into the controls for the subway system in Seoul. Okay, I don't know how deeply they penetrated, but I will suggest that in a world in which everything is connected to everything else, there are certain systems which at today's levels of cybersecurity really need to be isolated from the rest of the world, and those include industrial control systems, particularly industrial control systems malfunctions in which have non-trivial safety ramifications, which would be true of subway system controls and it would be true of nuclear plant controls, okay? We'd all love the glorious benefits of networking, but in some cases, not so fast.
You know, that, and when you first hear that those kinds of systems are exposed to the internet, it's kind of a forehead slap. Why would that be? And it's not stupid. I mean, there's a reason why. And the reason is that those systems have to be upgraded and serviced. And so the companies that make the software that run those systems typically leave a port open that allows a maintenance tech to get into that system and do the upgrade. And that's what, when we're getting these identifications back that systems are exposed to the internet, that's what's popping up and saying, hello, it's a maintenance port. Well, one of the reasons the Japanese are a little bit farther down on that scale is that they don't do it. They don't work that way. But Siemens, which makes one of the most widely used industrial SCADA systems, the basic software that runs factory automation, routinely designs its products with that kind of openness. They market it. It's considered a feature because it makes the system easier to upgrade and to service.
Okay, question third row here.
Hello, my name is Jung Kyun-mo from South Korea, and I have a question to Mr. Migley. And so, one quick question is that about your social media index. You mentioned about the combining the social media usage and the democracy index. My question is that, do you think that more democratic country has more vulnerability to the social to the cyber attack or the less vulnerability to the cyber attack? And my second question is kind of following up question to the asymmetric vulnerability. So yeah, I somehow get that there is more ways or more rooms to improve our defense mechanism by improving our legislative or regulatory system. And my question is that do you have a more efficient and available strategic option to increase the bottom countries, like their vulnerability?
First question first. Our naive assumption is simply a higher score on the democracy index corresponds to an increased level of vulnerability. That's the way we did the math. There's an argument to be made, and maybe you're going to make it, but that's the way we built it. On the second one, if I understood the question correctly, you're asking, is there a way for countries at the top of the list to increase the vulnerability of the countries at the bottom? Our research has not explored that very interesting and important issue. Clearly, the more skilled a country is at offensive cyber operations, the more deterrent power it's likely to command. I think that's a safe statement. But we have not explored technical methods or approaches for undertaking that kind of an effort.
I want to make a comment here. Let's say you have three individuals. One of them has only wireless, one of them has wireline but no wireless, and one of them has both wireline and wireless. Which one is the least vulnerable? It's number three, even though they have twice as much technology, because they have alternative ways of doing things. One of the strengths of the United States from a defensive perspective is we have a lot of ways of doing communications. And because they are, to the extent that they are different systems, and sometimes they're not as different as you think, but to the extent that they're different systems, it gives us a great deal of robustness. Okay, so it's not simply a matter of, oh, I got lots of electronics, therefore I'm in danger. You have to look at the type of attacks you're expecting, the type of things you're trying to defend, and the type of resources that you have to defend it with, okay? It used to be a standard in the world of cyber that the more developed you were, the more vulnerable you were. And then somebody in Israel took a look at this and said, look, we are clearly more electronically advanced than our neighbors are, but the fact that we are so much better at offensive cybersecurity than our neighbors are actually gives us an edge. And if you look at the relative use of cyber power in the Middle East, the gentleman was exactly correct. Israel can do things to the people that it likes much more effectively than the people that it doesn't like, than they can do back to Israel. Because the difference in offense overwhelms the difference in defense, or the difference in dependence. Dependence is not the same thing as vulnerability.
So your recommendation would be that South Korea should increase its offensive capabilities?
No, my idea is that they should sell more Samsungs to North Korea.
That's the market for large screen TVs for North Korean television. All right, any other questions out there? Well, while people are thinking up what they might want to ask, I want to follow up on a point that Eric, I think, raised in his opening remarks. This is directed mostly to Jack. He said that he thought that when the cyber Pearl Harbor comes, and then he didn't use that term, but basically, where's the vulnerability, right? So as you say, people don't know what they're talking about if they say that. But he thought it was going to be in the trust areas, right? That there would be a cyber attack that would undermine confidence in the financial system, or that would undermine confidence in politics through the kind of thing we saw in the 2016 election. How does that line up with the research you're talking about here? Do you give us leverage on those questions? And I wonder whether the Internet of Things has that potential too. If I feel I'm being spied on by my webcam or my cable box is somehow feeding out all the information, is there an Internet of Things dimension to the trust threat from cyber attacks or uses of cyber techniques?
One of the scenarios we talked about when we built we're doing the IoT index was raised by some of our Japanese friends. And it ran like this, and I don't know if it's a compelling story or not. Imagine that on a particular Monday morning, the day after Golden Week, On Monday morning, all of the elevators in the central business district of Tokyo went to the top floor of their buildings and turned off. And at the same time, all of the air handling systems in those buildings went down. And all the traffic lights in central Tokyo changed their timing. That's an IoT-based attack. I'm not equipped to assess its technical feasibility. I don't know. But we do know that those systems are open to the internet. There are a couple of things about that type of attack which seem troubling to our colleagues. One was, it would be very difficult even to detect that it was in fact an attack. It might be hours or even days, because no one has an incentive to report those events, and there's no mechanism in Japan through which they can be reported to the central government. So it could be quite a while before people realized that this wasn't just a mechanical problem, that an attack was in fact underway. Second,